Welcome, dear traveller, to this quiet corner of the evening, Werona of the evening, where stories unfold like whispered secrets, and mysteries drift through the shadows, like autumn leaves upon still water. I am so very glad you have found your way here tonight. Perhaps the world has felt too loud today. Perhaps your thoughts have been racing like wild horses across endless plains. Or perhaps you simply seek a gentle companion as you journey towards sleep. Whatever has brought you to this threshold, know that you are welcome here. In this space, we shall share together. Tonight, we embark upon a curious tale, one woven from gaslight and shadow, from the creak of old floorboards and the whisper of turning pages. It is a story designed not to startle you awake, but rather to guide you gently downward, deeper and deeper into that soft realm where consciousness blurs and dreams begin their quiet work. Let this narrative be a river that carries you, unhurried and calm, toward the distant shore of morning. Now, settle yourself into whatever comfort you have found. Adjust your pillows, draw your blankets close, let your body sink into the embrace of bed or chair. Feel the weight of the day beginning to lift from your shoulders. Breathe with me now, slowly, deeply. In through the nose, hold for just a moment, and out through slightly parted lips. Again, in and out. Let each breath carry away a little more tension, a little more of the tightness you have been holding. And now, as the rain begins to patter against imagined window panes, as the fire crackles in a distant hearth, let us begin. The year was 1897, and London wore November like a shroud of grey velvet, soft and heavy and endless. Rain had been falling for 3 days without pause. That peculiar London rain that does not pour, but rather hangs in the air like a living mist, turning cobblestones to mirrors and reducing the great city to a watercolour painting where all the edges had been gently smudged by an artist's dampened thumb. The gaslights along Baker Street struggled against the gloom, their yellow flames creating small islands of warmth in an ocean of shadow. Inside number 221B, the sitting room existed as a world unto itself, separate from the grey dampness beyond its walls. A fire burned with devoted enthusiasm in the grate, sending dancing shadows across the familiar chaos of the room. Books lay open upon every surface, their pages marked with scraps of paper, covered in cramped notation. The chemical apparatus on the side table caught the firelight and transformed it into small jewels of amber and gold. The air held the mingled scents of pipe tobacco, old leather, wood smoke, and that particular mustiness that belongs only to rooms where great thoughts are contemplated and mysteries are unravelled. Thread by careful thread, Holmes stood with his long fingers pressed together before his lips, his grey eyes focused upon something far beyond the rain-streaked glass, beyond Baker Street, beyond London itself, perhaps. He had been standing thus for nearly an hour, moving only occasionally to draw upon his pipe, the smoke curling upward in lazy spirals, to join the shadows near the ceiling. Watson knew better than to interrupt such a reverie. The case they had recently concluded, the matter of the Blackwood inheritance, had been solved neatly enough, but Holmes seemed unsatisfied, as though he sensed some larger pattern just beyond his ability to perceive it. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked with soothing regularity, marking the passage of moments that seemed to stretch and expand in the warm, quiet room. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels making that particular wet sound against the cobblestones. And somewhere distant, a dog barked once and fell silent. These small sounds only seemed to deepen the sense of peaceful isolation, as though 221B existed in a pocket outside of time itself. Watson's eyelids had just begun to grow heavy, the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the rain creating a gentle lullaby, when the sound came that would mark the true beginning of our tale. A knock upon the door, but not the confident knock of Mrs. Hudson bringing tea, nor the authoritative rap of a police inspector seeking consultation. This was a different sort of knock, hesitant and strangely rhythmic. 3 slow taps, a pause, then 2 more, as though whoever stood beyond the threshold was sending some sort of coded message, or was perhaps so overcome with uncertainty that they knocked in stages, gathering courage with each attempt. Holmes turned from the window immediately, his entire demeanour transformed. The distant, contemplative expression vanished, replaced by that keen alertness that Watson had witnessed 1,000 times. Holmes moved with sudden purpose toward the door, pausing only to glance at the clock. 10:30, he murmured, more to himself than to Watson. An unusual hour for a caller, and yet something in that knock suggests a matter that could not wait for morning. He opened the door to reveal Mrs. Hudson on the landing, her candle casting wavering shadows upon the walls, and behind her, a figure wrapped in a travelling cloak so saturated with rain that water pooled upon the floor beneath. The visitor was a woman, that much was clear, though her features remained largely hidden by the hood of her cloak, and by the shadows that seemed to cling to her like morning veils. "A lady to see you, Mr. Holmes," Mrs. Hudson said, her voice carrying that particular blend of concern and disapproval she reserved for late-night callers who dripped upon her floors. She insisted it could not wait until morning. I told her you might not be receiving visitors at this hour, but she was quite insistent. Holmes stepped aside immediately, gesturing for the woman to enter. "Of course, Mrs. Hudson, please show her in, and perhaps some fresh tea. The lady has clearly travelled some distance through this miserable weather." The woman entered the sitting room with an odd hesitation in her movements, as though she was not quite certain where she was, or how she had come to be there. Holmes guided her to the chair opposite Watson's, the one that had hosted countless clients over the years, each bringing their own species of trouble to lay before the great detective's consideration. She sat slowly, her damp cloak spreading around her like dark water, and with trembling hands pushed back her hood. She was perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair streaked with premature grey, and eyes that held a particular quality Watson had seen before, in soldiers who had witnessed things that could not be unseen. Her face was pale, almost luminously so in the firelight, and her hands, when she reached up to unfasten the clasp of her cloak, shook with such violence that Holmes gently intervened, helping her remove the sodden garment. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire and the steady drumming of rain against the windows. "Forgive me for calling at such an hour. I did not know where else to turn." Holmes settled himself into his chair, his posture relaxed yet attentive. "You need not apologize, madam. Trouble does not wait for convenient hours, and if your journey has brought you to my door on such a night, then I suspect your trouble is considerable indeed. But before we discuss the matter that weighs so heavily upon you, let us attend to your comfort. You are chilled to the bone, and no mystery can be properly addressed while one is in physical distress." Mrs. Hudson arrived with the tea tray, and Watson busied himself with the familiar ritual of preparation, measuring leaves, pouring steaming water, allowing the brew to steep, while the woman gradually ceased her shaking. The small domestic ceremony seemed to calm her somewhat, and by the time Watson pressed a warm cup into her hands, some colour had returned to her cheeks. Before you drift further into sleep tonight, I wonder, dear listener, if you might pause for just a moment to share where you find yourself in this world, and what hour keeps you company as you listen to these words. She sipped the tea gratefully, both hands wrapped around the cup, as though drawing warmth from it into her very soul. For a long moment she simply sat, gathering herself, and neither Holmes nor Watson pressed her. They had learned long ago that troubled souls needed time to find their words, and that patience was often the greatest gift they could offer. Finally, she spoke, her voice still soft but steadier now. "My name is Eleanor Ashford," she began, "and I fear I have come to you with a matter that will sound like the ravings of a mad woman. Indeed, I have asked myself repeatedly whether I have gone quite mad, whether the grief has broken something in my mind that cannot be repaired. But I must speak, I must tell someone, and if anyone in London might believe what I have to say, might help me understand what has been happening, it would be you, Mr. Holmes." Holmes leaned forward slightly, his fingers pressed together in that characteristic gesture. "I assure you, Miss Ashford, that I have heard tales far stranger than anything you are likely to tell me, and I have found that what appears to be madness is often merely truth wearing an unfamiliar face. Please, tell us what has brought you through the rain to my door." Eleanor Ashford took another sip of tea, drew a deep breath, and began her story, her words falling into the warm, firelit room like drops of rain upon still water. "3 months ago, my brother disappeared. His name was Thomas Ashford, and he was a scholar of antiquities, specializing in pre-Christian British religious practices. He had been excavating a site in Cornwall, near the village of Pendower, investigating what he believed to be a ritual complex dating back to the time before Rome came to these shores. He was meticulous in his work, methodical, rational, to the point of skepticism. He did not believe in ghosts or spirits, or any of the supernatural explanations that surround such ancient places. And yet," she paused, her hands tightening around her teacup, until Watson feared it might crack. "And yet, in his final letter to me, posted just 2 days before he vanished, he wrote things that troubled me deeply. He spoke of symbols he had uncovered, symbols that appeared in no reference texts he could find. He mentioned having the sensation of being watched, even when he was quite alone in the excavation. Most disturbing of all, he referenced something he called the bone collector, though he provided no explanation of what this meant, only saying that he would tell me everything when he returned to London. Outside, the rain seemed to intensify, drumming against the windows with increased urgency, as though the weather itself was responding to the darkness creeping into Eleanor Ashford's tale. The fire popped and crackled, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney, and somewhere in the building a floorboard creaked with the settling of old wood. "He never returned," Eleanor continued, her voice growing softer with each word. "The local constabulary conducted a search, of course, but found nothing. No body, no signs of violence, nothing but his tent still standing at the excavation site, his tools laid out as though he had simply stepped away for a moment and would return directly. His journal was found, but the final entries had been torn out. Only scraps remained, fragments of words and drawings that made no sense. "And yet you believe there is more to tell," Holmes said quietly, his grey eyes fixed upon their visitor with complete attention. "Yes," Eleanor whispered, "because 2 weeks ago I began receiving parcels." Watson felt a small chill travel down his spine despite the warmth of the fire. There was something in the way she said that word, parcels, that suggested they contained nothing pleasant. Each parcel arrives with no return address, wrapped in brown paper and tied with black cord. Inside, she paused, seeming to struggle with the words. "Inside are bones, Mr. Holmes. Small bones, animal bones, I think, though I cannot be certain. Each one has been marked with symbols carved into the surface, the same symbols my brother described in his letter, and with each parcel comes a single card bearing a message." "What do these messages say?" Holmes asked, though his tone suggested he was not certain he wished to know the answer. Eleanor Ashford reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a small stack of cards, perhaps 5 or 6 in total, each one yellowed and stained, as though they had been exposed to damp earth. She handed them to Holmes with obvious reluctance, as though touching them caused her physical pain. Holmes examined the cards in silence, holding each one close to the firelight, his expression growing increasingly grave. Finally, he passed them to Watson, who read them with mounting unease. The messages were brief, written in a spidery hand that seemed to crawl across the paper. "The bones remember. He disturbed the rest. The collection grows. You should not have come seeking. We keep what we gather." The wind outside rose suddenly, rattling the windows in their frames, and the gaslights flickered as though some presence had passed through the room, drawing breath from the very flames. In that moment of wavering light, Watson could have sworn he saw something move in the shadows near the doorway. But when the light steadied, there was nothing there but darkness and the ordinary chaos of Holmes's sitting room. Eleanor Ashford was watching them both with desperate hope. "Tell me I am not mad, Mr. Holmes. Tell me there is some rational explanation for all of this. Tell me my brother can still be found." Holmes set down the cards with careful deliberation, his expression unreadable. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Watson had learned to recognize as the tone he used when a case had caught his interest completely, when the game, as Holmes called it, was truly afoot. "I will tell you this, Miss Ashford," Holmes said slowly, his words measured and precise. "You are not mad. Something is indeed happening here, something that requires investigation and explanation. Whether your brother can be found, I cannot yet say. But I give you my word that I shall endeavour to uncover the truth of this matter, wherever that truth may lead us." The fire burned lower, casting longer shadows across the room, and the rain continued its endless conversation with the London night, whispering secrets against the glass, murmuring promises and warnings in equal measure. Eleanor Ashford's hands had finally ceased their trembling, though whether from the warmth of the tea or from the relief of having shared her burden, Watson could not say. Watson could not say. Holmes remained motionless in his chair, his fingers still pressed together, his eyes distant once more, though now Watson recognized that particular quality of distance as the detective's mind arranging facts into patterns, sorting through possibilities with the precision of a scholar cataloguing ancient manuscripts. The sitting room had grown darker as the fire burned lower, and Mrs. Hudson had long since retired to her own quarters below. leaving the three of them suspended in a bubble of lamplight and shadow. The rain had settled into a steady rhythm, neither intensifying nor diminishing, as though it might continue forever, as though the world beyond Baker Street had dissolved entirely and only this room remained, this small island of warmth and reason in an ocean of mystery. Watson found himself studying the cards that lay upon the table between them, those yellowed fragments with their crawling script. There was something deeply unsettling about them, something that went beyond the mere words they contained. The paper itself seemed wrong somehow, too thick and too rough, with an odd texture that reminded him of parchment made from animal skin rather than proper writing paper. And the ink, when he leaned closer to examine it, had a peculiar brown quality that made him think uncomfortably of dried blood, though surely it was merely some variety of sepia or walnut ink. "These cards," Holmes said suddenly, breaking the long silence, "are of considerable interest. Miss Ashford, you said they arrived with each parcel of bones. How many parcels have you received in total?" "6," Eleanor replied, her voice stronger now, as though speaking the truth aloud had restored some measure of her courage. "The first arrived exactly 2 weeks after Thomas was declared missing. They have come at irregular intervals since then, sometimes with only 3 days between them, sometimes with as much as a fortnight. There seems to be no pattern that I can discern." Holmes nodded slowly, reaching for one of the cards and holding it up to the lamplight, turning it this way and that, examining it from every angle. "And the bones themselves? Do you still have them?" "Yes, I could not bring myself to dispose of them, though I wish to. They are at my lodgings in Bloomsbury. I have kept them separate from one another, each in its original wrapping, exactly as they were received." "Excellent," Holmes murmured, still absorbed in his examination of the card. "Watson, would you be so kind as to bring me the magnifying glass from the desk? And the calipers as well, I think." Watson rose with the comfortable ease of long practice, crossing to the cluttered desk and retrieving the requested instruments. As he moved through the room, he became aware of how the shadows seemed to deepen in the corners, how the familiar space had taken on an unfamiliar quality, as though the very act of speaking about ancient bones and mysterious disappearances had altered the atmosphere, had allowed something strange to seep through the walls like damp. He handed the magnifying glass to Holmes, who bent over the card with intense concentration, moving the lens slowly across its surface. Minutes passed in silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock and the whisper of rain. Then Holmes made a small sound of satisfaction, that particular "ah" that Watson had heard countless times before. The sound that meant a clue had revealed itself. "Most interesting," Holmes said, straightening in his chair. "Watson, Miss Ashford, observe this if you would." He held the card at an angle to the light, pointing with one long finger at the edge of the paper. "Do you see these fibres here, along the torn edge? This paper was not cut with scissors or blade, but rather torn from a larger sheet, and torn hastily if I am any judge. And here, do you see, the faintest impression of text, backwards and inverted, as though this card had been pressed against another document while ink was still wet." Watson leaned closer, squinting at the card. With Holmes pointing it out, he could just barely make out what his friend described. A ghost of text that was too faint to read, but unmistakably present. "What does it mean?" Eleanor asked, hope kindling in her voice. "It means," Holmes replied, setting down the card with careful precision, "that whoever sent these parcels is not quite as careful as they might believe themselves to be. They have left traces, breadcrumbs, if you will, that may lead us back to their source, but we shall need to examine the other evidence more closely. Miss Ashford, I wonder if you might permit us to visit your lodgings tomorrow to inspect the bones themselves and the wrappings in which they arrived." "Of course, yes, anything that might help find Thomas." "Before we examine the physical evidence further," Holmes said, opening the first book, "we must understand the context in which your brother was working. You mentioned he was excavating a pre-Christian ritual site in Cornwall. Do you know which specific period he believed the site dated from?" Eleanor frowned in concentration, clearly trying to recall details from letters and conversations. He thought it was Iron Age, possibly earlier. He had found evidence of repeated use over many centuries, layers of activity that suggested the site held continuous significance for the local population. There were carved stones, he said, arranged in patterns that suggested astronomical observations, and beneath those, older structures that had been deliberately buried, as though each generation built atop what came before. Holmes nodded, his fingers already moving through the pages of the first book, which Watson could see was a scholarly treatise on ancient British religious practices. "And the village, Pendower. It is quite remote, I imagine." "Very remote. Thomas chose it precisely because it had been so little disturbed by modern development. The locals were not particularly welcoming, he said. They have old superstitions about the headland where he was excavating, tales of rituals and sacrifices, and things that walk in the moonlight. He dismissed it all as folklore, of course." At that moment, a coal shifted in the grate, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and causing all three of them to startle slightly. The fire flared briefly, illuminating the room with sudden brightness before settling once more into its steady glow. Watson found himself wondering if the temperature had dropped, if perhaps the wind had shifted and was now driving rain against a different window, because he felt distinctly colder than he had moments before. Holmes seemed not to notice, his attention fixed upon the pages before him. He read in silence for several minutes, occasionally marking a passage with his finger or making a small notation on a scrap of paper. Then he moved to the second book, and then the third, his eyes moving rapidly across the dense text. "Here," he said at last, tapping a page in the final volume. "This is most suggestive. Watson, Miss Ashford, listen to this passage. It is from Reverend Macken's Antiquities of the Celtic Peoples, published in 1872. He writes, "Among the coastal tribes of Cornwall, there persisted into the early medieval period a peculiar cult devoted to the preservation of the dead. Unlike the more common practice of cremation or simple burial, these practitioners engaged in a ritual disarticulation of remains, separating bone from bone and marking each with symbols meant to bind the spirit to the physical world. They believed that the dead, if properly preserved and properly honoured, could serve as intermediaries between the living and the powers that dwelt beneath the earth and below the sea." Holmes looked up from the book, his grey eyes intense in the lamplight. The text goes on to describe how these practitioners were called by various names, but the most common was bone keepers, or bone collectors. They were both feared and revered, consulted in times of crisis, avoided at all other times. Eleanor had gone pale again, her hand rising to her throat. Then Thomas was investigating one of their sites, one of these bone collector locations. It would appear so, Holmes said quietly. And if your brother discovered something significant, if he unearthed remains that someone wished to keep hidden, or if he violated protocols that certain individuals still observe. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Holmes rose once more, this time moving to the window where he had stood earlier in the evening, though his manner now was quite different. Before, he had been contemplative, distant. Now he was alert, focused, his entire being concentrated upon the problem that Eleanor Ashford had laid before them. "Miss Ashford," he said, without turning from the window, "I must ask you a question that may seem odd, but I assure you it is relevant. In his letters, did your brother mention meeting anyone in particular in Pendower? Any locals who took an unusual interest in his work, either positive or negative?" Eleanor considered this, her brow furrowed. There was one man he mentioned several times, a local fisherman named Carrick, I believe, or perhaps Garrick. Thomas wrote that this man seemed to know a great deal about the site, more than one might expect from a simple fisherman. He would sometimes appear at the excavation and watch from a distance, never speaking, never approaching, just watching. Thomas found it unsettling at first, but he became accustomed to it. He even attempted to engage the man in conversation once, but the fellow simply turned and walked away without a word. "Interesting," Holmes murmured. He remained at the window a moment longer, then turned back to face them, his decision clearly made. "We must go to Cornwall. There is nothing more we can accomplish here in London, and the answers we seek lie in Pendower, at the excavation site, among the people who live in the shadow of that ancient place. But tonight, you must return to your lodgings and rest, Miss Ashford. You are exhausted, and the journey ahead will be demanding. Tomorrow morning, Watson and I shall call upon you to examine the bones and their wrappings. Then we shall make arrangements for travel." Eleanor stood, looking as though an enormous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Thank you, Mr. Holmes. Thank you both. I cannot tell you what it means to me to have someone believe me, to have someone willing to help." Holmes inclined his head with uncharacteristic gentleness. "We shall find the truth, Miss Ashford. Whether that truth includes your brother alive and well, I cannot promise, but we shall find it nonetheless." Watson helped Eleanor with her still damp cloak and saw her to the door, where he summoned a cab, despite the lateness of the hour and the persistence of the rain. As the carriage pulled away, carrying their visitor back toward Bloomsbury, Watson returned to the sitting room to find Holmes standing once more before the fire, which had burned down to glowing embers, casting a deep red light across his angular features. "What do you think, Holmes?" Watson asked quietly, settling back into his chair. "Is there truly something supernatural about this business, or is it merely designed to appear so?" Holmes was silent for a long moment, staring into the dying fire. When he finally spoke, his voice was thoughtful, almost meditative. "I have learned, Watson, never to dismiss any possibility until I have examined all the evidence. The world is far stranger than our philosophies allow, and I have seen things in my career that defy simple explanation. But I have also seen how humans, when motivated by greed or fear or fanaticism, can create illusions of the supernatural that are far more effective than any genuine haunting might be." He turned to face Watson, and in the dim light, his expression was unreadable. What I do know is this: a man has disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His sister is receiving parcels that are clearly meant to frighten her, to warn her away from investigating his fate. Someone went to considerable effort to create those cards, to select those bones, to maintain this campaign of psychological intimidation. That suggests two things. First, that there is indeed something to hide, something that warrants such elaborate measures to keep hidden. And second, that whoever is behind this believes themselves untouchable, believes that ancient superstition will protect them where modern law might not. Watson nodded slowly, feeling the weight of the case settling upon his shoulders. When do we leave for Cornwall? The day after tomorrow, if we can arrange it. Tomorrow we examine Miss Ashford's evidence, and I must send some telegrams, make some inquiries. I want to know everything there is to know about Pendower, about the excavation, about this man Carrick or Garrick who watched from a distance. Knowledge is our greatest weapon, Watson, and I intend to arm ourselves well before we venture into territory where old beliefs still hold power. Morning arrived in London like a hesitant guest. Part 3. Morning arrived in London like a hesitant guest, pale and uncertain, the grey light filtering through departing rain clouds with the quality of something half remembered, a dream not quite solidified into waking. The storm had passed during the small hours, leaving behind a city washed clean and strangely quiet, as though the rain had carried away not only the dust and soot, but also some essential noise, some vital chaos that usually animated the great metropolis. Watson woke to the sound of a teacup being set upon a saucer, that particular gentle chiming that spoke of Mrs. Hudson's careful morning ministrations. He opened his eyes to find pale sunlight, thin as gauze, stretching across his bedroom floor, and for a moment he simply lay there, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house coming to life around him, the creak of floorboards, the distant murmur of voices from the street below, the song of a sparrow that had found its perch somewhere near his window. When he descended to the sitting room some 30 minutes later, dressed and washed, and feeling considerably more human than he had in the depths of the previous night, he found Holmes already awake and engaged in what appeared to be a small scientific experiment at the chemistry table. Various beakers and retorts were arranged in careful alignment, and a small flame burned beneath a glass vessel filled with some amber liquid that bubbled gently, releasing wisps of steam that caught the morning light and transformed it into something almost magical. "Ah, Watson," Holmes said without looking up from his work. "I trust you slept reasonably well, despite the rather unsettling nature of Miss Ashford's tale." Watson poured himself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had left warming by the fire, which had been newly stoked and now crackled with morning cheerfulness. "Well enough, considering. And you? Did you sleep at all? Or have you been conducting experiments through the night?" Holmes smiled faintly, adjusting a valve on one of his glass tubes. "I managed a few hours. My mind was rather occupied with questions, and I find that chemical analysis often helps to settle my thoughts. I have been examining the ink used on those cards Miss Ashford brought us. The results are quite illuminating." He gestured to a series of glass slides arranged on the table, each one bearing a small stain of brown. "This is not ordinary ink, Watson. It is indeed a form of sepia, but the source is unusual. Most sepia ink derives from cuttlefish, but this has a different chemical signature. I believe it may have been rendered from whelks, or perhaps dogfish, both of which are common in Cornish waters. More significantly, the ink contains trace amounts of human albumin. Watson had been raising his teacup to his lips, but paused mid-motion. Human albumin? You mean? Blood, yes, mixed with the ink in minute quantities. Not enough to change the colour significantly, but enough to be detected through proper analysis. Whoever prepared this ink wanted to create something that was symbolically powerful, something that bound the physical message to human essence. It is an old practice, found in many cultures, the mingling of blood with ink to give words additional weight, additional power. A chill passed through Watson, despite the warmth of the fire, and he found himself setting down his teacup with more force than intended, the porcelain rattling against the saucer. Holmes noticed, but said nothing, merely continuing his work with that methodical precision that characterized all his endeavors. They breakfasted in companionable silence, Holmes absorbed in his notes, Watson attempting to read the morning newspaper, but finding his attention repeatedly drawn to the window, where the pale sun was making its slow progress across a sky still heavy with clouds. The city was coming fully awake now, the sounds of hooves and wheels and voices rising up from Baker Street, life reasserting itself after the long night's rain. At precisely 9 o'clock, Holmes set aside his work, consulted his pocket watch, and announced that it was time to call upon Miss Ashford. They gathered their coats and hats, Holmes adding a small leather case to his pocket. The one Watson knew contained various tools for close examination, magnifying lenses and calipers, and other instruments of his peculiar trade. The journey to Bloomsbury took them through streets still slick with last night's rain, the cobblestones gleaming like polished stone, reflecting the facades of buildings in broken mirrors. Their cab rattled past shops just opening, past newspaper boys calling the morning's headlines, past a flower girl selling late autumn blooms from a basket, purple heather and white chrysanthemums, flowers that spoke of endings and remembrance. Eleanor Ashford's lodgings proved to be in a tall, narrow house on a quiet street lined with plane trees that had shed most of their leaves in the recent storms. The bare branches reached toward the sky like supplicating hands, and the fallen leaves lay thick upon the pavement, creating a carpet of gold and brown that rustled softly as Watson and Holmes approached the door. Miss Ashford herself answered their knock, looking considerably more composed than she had the previous night, though the dark circles beneath her eyes spoke of sleep that had been troubled when it came at all. She wore a simple dress of grey wool, her hair pinned severely back, and Watson thought she had the look of someone who had spent the night making difficult decisions, coming to terms with realities she would have preferred to deny. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, please come in," she said, stepping aside to allow them entry. "I have prepared everything as you requested. The bones and their wrappings are in my sitting room, laid out for your examination." She led them up a narrow staircase to the first floor, where her apartments consisted of a sitting room, a small bedroom, visible through an open door, and presumably a kitchen somewhere beyond. The sitting room was modestly furnished, but comfortable, with a window overlooking the street, and a small fireplace where a fire burned low. Upon a table in the centre of the room, she had arranged 6 parcels, each still in its original brown paper wrapping, the black cord that had bound them now loosened but not removed. Holmes approached the table with the focused intensity of a priest approaching an altar. And indeed, there was something ritualistic in the way he moved, circling the table slowly, examining the parcels from every angle before touching them. Watson remained near the door with Miss Ashford, watching his friend work, knowing from long experience that Holmes saw things others missed, that his eyes could extract meaning from the smallest details. "Miss Ashford," Holmes said without looking up, "you mentioned these arrived at irregular intervals. Can you recall the specific dates of each delivery?" Eleanor moved to a small writing desk and retrieved a piece of paper upon which she had evidently recorded this information. The first arrived on September 20th, the second on September 24th, the third on October 1st, the fourth on October 9th, the fifth on October 23rd, and the most recent on November 3rd, just 1 week ago. Holmes nodded, producing a small notebook from his pocket and copying down these dates. And were they delivered by post or by some other means? By post, each one, though the postmarks were illegible, deliberately smudged as though someone had wetted them after posting. The stamps were genuine enough, but the postmarks themselves revealed nothing about where they originated. At that moment, a loud crash echoed from somewhere below, the sound of breaking crockery, followed by a woman's voice raised in irritation. All three of them started at the sudden noise, and Eleanor gave an embarrassed laugh. "Mrs. Pemberton, my landlady. She is rather clumsy, I am afraid, always dropping things. I have grown accustomed to it, but I apologize for the disturbance." Holmes merely shrugged, already focused once more on the parcels. He selected the first one, the one Eleanor had identified as arriving on September 20th, and carefully untied the black cord. The cord itself was of interest, Watson noted, for it was not ordinary string, but rather what appeared to be hand-twisted fibre, rough and uneven, the sort of thing that might have been made using old methods, spun by hand rather than produced by machine. Holmes unwrapped the brown paper with exquisite care, spreading it flat upon the table so that every crease and mark was visible. Inside lay a small bone, perhaps 4 inches in length, yellowed with age. It was clearly from an animal, possibly a sheep or goat, Watson thought, though he was no expert in such matters. What was unmistakable, however, were the symbols that had been carved into its surface. The markings were crude but deliberate, a series of lines and circles, and what might have been letters from an alphabet Watson did not recognize. They had been cut deep into the bone, the grooves dark with what might have been dirt, or might have been something else. Something Watson preferred not to contemplate too closely. Holmes produced a magnifying glass and examined the bone minutely, turning it over and over, holding it up to the light from the window, even bringing it close to his nose to smell it. He worked in complete silence, and Watson knew better than to interrupt, knew that Holmes's mind was cataloguing every detail, every irregularity, storing information that would later be assembled into conclusions that would seem miraculous to those who did not understand his methods. After perhaps 10 minutes, Holmes set down the first bone and reached for the second parcel. The process was repeated, and then again with the third, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth. Each bone was different in size and shape, though all bore similar markings. Some were darker than others, some smoother, suggesting different ages or different methods of preservation. The symbols varied slightly from bone to bone, but certain elements appeared repeatedly, suggesting a system of meaning, a language of sorts carved into dead matter. When Holmes had examined all 6 bones, he straightened slowly, pressing his hands to the small of his back as though working out some stiffness that had accumulated during his careful study. He moved to the window and stood there for a moment, looking out at the street below, at the pale sun struggling through clouds, at the ordinary life of London flowing past, utterly unaware of the dark currents that ran beneath its surface. "These are human bones," he said quietly, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade through still water. Eleanor gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, and Watson felt his own stomach tighten with revulsion and dread. Holmes turned from the window to face them, his expression grave. "They are not recent deaths," I hasten to add. "These bones are old, very old, perhaps centuries old. They have been interred in peat or in some acidic soil that has preserved them remarkably well. But there can be no doubt about their origin. These are human finger bones, Miss Ashford, phalanges to be precise, carefully selected and prepared for use in whatever ritual purpose these symbols represent." "Then Thomas found graves," Eleanor whispered, her voice trembling. "He found human remains at the site, and whoever sent these, they are warning me that the same fate awaits anyone who disturbs what should remain hidden." Holmes crossed to her, his manner gentle despite the grimness of his news. "That is certainly one interpretation, and likely the one we are meant to draw. But consider this, Miss Ashford. Why would anyone go to such elaborate lengths to frighten you if your brother were already dead? If they had killed him, hidden his body, eliminated the threat he represented, what purpose would these parcels serve? They draw attention. They invite investigation. They are the opposite of what one does when trying to conceal a crime." Eleanor looked up at him with desperate hope kindling in her eyes. "Then you think Thomas might still be alive?" "I think," Holmes said carefully, "that these parcels serve a purpose beyond simple intimidation. I think someone wants us to come to Cornwall, wants us to investigate, wants us to follow this trail of breadcrumbs they have so carefully laid out. The question we must answer is why. What game is being played here, and what do our opponents hope to gain by drawing us into it?" He turned back to the table, gathering the bones and wrapping them once more in their brown paper, replacing the black cords with practiced efficiency. "I shall take these with me, if you have no objection, Miss Ashford. I wish to conduct further analysis, and I believe they will be safer in my possession than remaining here where they might attract unwanted attention." Eleanor nodded mutely, watching as Holmes carefully placed all 6 parcels into the leather case he had brought with him. When this was done, he consulted his pocket watch once more, then looked to Watson. "We have much to do before we can depart for Cornwall. I have telegrams to send, inquiries to make, arrangements to finalize. Miss Ashford, I suggest you spend today preparing for travel. Pack lightly, but for cold weather and rough conditions. We shall call for you tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock sharp. The journey will take the better part of a day, and I wish to arrive in Pendower before nightfall." They took their leave shortly thereafter, emerging from the quiet house into the bustle of Bloomsbury. The leather case with its grim contents held securely under Holmes's arm. As they walked toward the main thoroughfare where they might hail a cab, Watson found himself looking at the faces of people they passed, wondering if any of them might be watching, might be reporting back to whoever had sent those bones, those cards, those messages written in ink mixed with blood. The pale sun had climbed higher now. though it remained half hidden behind clouds that promised more rain before the day was done. London stretched around them in all directions, vast and complex and full of secrets, and somewhere within it, or far beyond it, in the wild reaches of Cornwall, where the land grew strange and the old ways persisted, a man had disappeared, and mysteries were waiting to be unravelled, thread by careful thread, bone by ancient bone. The railway carriage swayed with hypnotic rhythm as the train carried them westward, away from Eltham westward, away from London's smoke and clamour, away from the familiar geometries of civilization, and toward landscapes that grew increasingly wild with each passing mile. Holmes sat opposite Watson in their first-class compartment. His long frame relaxed against the upholstered seat, his eyes half closed as though he were dozing, though Watson knew his friend's mind was working with its usual relentless intensity, arranging and rearranging the fragments of their puzzle into patterns that might eventually reveal the truth. Eleanor Ashford occupied the seat beside Watson, her gaze fixed upon the window, where the countryside rolled past in shades of grey and brown and dying green, the colours of late autumn in England, the season when the earth prepares itself for sleep, and all living things draw inward, conserving warmth and light against the coming dark. She had spoken little since they departed Paddington Station that morning, and Watson respected her silence, understanding that she was girding herself for whatever waited at journey's end. The compartment smelled of coal smoke and leather and the peculiar mustiness that belonged to all railway carriages, no matter how well maintained. Rain began to spatter against the windows as they passed through Somerset, light at first, then heavier, transforming the landscape beyond the glass into a watercolour painting, where all the edges bled together, where sky and earth merged into a single grey expanse, punctuated only by the occasional dark shape of a tree or building. Watson found himself lulled by the motion of the train, by the rhythmic clacking of wheels upon rails, that ancient lullaby of travel that had the power to loosen thoughts and send the mind wandering down strange corridors of memory and imagination. He thought of other journeys he had taken with Holmes, other mysteries they had pursued into distant corners of the realm, and he wondered, not for the first time, at the strange life he had chosen, or perhaps that had chosen him, a life of sudden departures and dark revelations, of standing witness to the peculiar dramas that unfolded in the margins of respectable society. Hours passed in this manner, the three of them suspended between departure and arrival, existing in that peculiar liminal space that belongs only to travel, where one is neither here nor there, but somewhere in between, unmoored from ordinary time and ordinary concerns. They stopped briefly at Exeter to change trains, standing on the platform in the rain, while porters transferred their luggage, and Holmes smoked a cigarette with fierce concentration, staring at nothing, or perhaps at everything, with that particular quality of attention he brought to problems that had caught his interest completely. The second train was smaller, older, its carriages less comfortable than those of the London Express. They shared their compartment now with other travellers, a farmer with weathered hands who dozed in one corner, a young woman reading a novel who occasionally glanced at them with curious eyes, and an elderly clergyman who muttered prayers under his breath while fingering a worn rosary. The presence of strangers imposed a different kind of silence, one that prevented conversation but seemed to amplify thought, and Watson found himself studying his companions as a novelist might, wondering at their stories, at the threads of fate that had brought them all together in this rattling compartment as the train pressed deeper into Cornwall. The landscape had changed dramatically now, the gentle rolling hills of Somerset giving way to something altogether wilder and more ancient. The fields were smaller here, bounded by walls of dark stone rather than hedgerows, and the trees grew twisted and bent as though shaped by constant wind from the sea. The rain continued its steady falling, and the sky had darkened to the colour of old pewter, heavy and low, pressing down upon the earth with visible weight. Suddenly, the train lurched violently, throwing Watson forward in his seat. A terrible grinding sound filled the compartment, metal shrieking against metal, and for a heart-stopping moment he thought they were about to derail. The farmer jerked awake with a shout. The young woman dropped her book, and Eleanor clutched at the armrest with white-knuckled hands. Then, just as abruptly, the train steadied, the grinding ceased, and they continued onward, though at a noticeably reduced speed. Holmes opened his eyes fully for the first time in hours, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. An obstruction on the tracks, I expect, or perhaps a mechanical difficulty. Nothing catastrophic, at any rate, or we should have felt rather more than that. The conductor appeared at their compartment door moments later, confirming Holmes's assessment. Nothing to worry about, ladies and gentlemen. Just a bit of debris on the line. Cleared now, though we'll be running a touch slower the rest of the way as a precaution. We'll still arrive in Penzance on schedule, more or less. As the conductor moved on to reassure other passengers, Watson became aware that his heart was racing, that the sudden shock had jolted him fully awake from the trance-like state the journey had induced. He glanced at Eleanor and saw that she too had been shaken, though whether by the train's lurching or by something else, some private fear or premonition, he could not say. They reached Penzance as afternoon was beginning its slow fade toward evening, the rain still falling with that particularly Cornish persistence that suggested it might continue for days without pause. The station was small and grey, its platform puddled with water, and the few people waiting there had the hunched, resigned look of those who had long ago made peace with perpetual dampness. Holmes had arranged for a hired carriage to meet them, and the driver, a taciturn man with a face like weathered granite, loaded their luggage with grim efficiency before gesturing them aboard. The carriage was old but serviceable, its leather seats cracked but still comfortable, and as they set off through the narrow streets of Penzance, Watson peered out at a town that seemed to exist in defiance of the elements, its stone buildings hunkered against the wind, its windows small and few, as though the inhabitants had learned over centuries to turn their backs on the weather and find what light they could within. The journey from Penzance to Pendower took nearly another hour, following a coastal road that wound between the sea and steep hills, covered in gorse and heather. The ocean was visible in glimpses between breaks in the land, grey and restless beneath the grey sky. Its surface churned into white-capped waves that crashed against dark rocks with a violence that was somehow mesmerizing. Watson found himself unable to look away from those brief visions of the sea, drawn to its power and its indifference, to the way it simply was, eternal and uncaring, grinding stone to sand and sand to nothing over the patient passage of centuries. As they climbed higher along the coast road, Eleanor spoke for the first time since morning. "I have never been to Pendower," she said softly. "Thomas would describe it in his letters, but I could never quite picture it. He said it was like stepping backward in time, like finding a place that the modern world had forgotten. Remote communities often preserve traditions long after they have faded elsewhere, Holmes replied, his voice pitched low so as not to disturb the driver. Whether those traditions are benign or otherwise, well, that remains to be seen. The road descended now, following a steep valley toward the coast, and suddenly the village of Pendower came into view below them, a small collection of perhaps 24 stone cottages, clustered around a tiny harbour where several fishing boats lay at anchor, rising and falling on the swell. Beyond the village, a headland jutted into the sea like an accusing finger, its summit crowned with what appeared to be standing stones, dark shapes visible even through the rain and gathering dusk. The carriage rattled down the final stretch of road and into the village proper, where the buildings pressed close to the narrow street as though seeking shelter from one another. There were no gaslights here, Watson noted, only the yellow glow of candles and oil lamps behind thick glass windows. And the few people he glimpsed hurrying through the rain moved with their heads down, their faces hidden, as though to look up might invite unwanted attention from something watching from above. The driver brought them to a halt before the largest building in the village, a 3-story structure that bore a weathered sign identifying it as the Mariner's Rest. "This be the only lodging in Pendower," the driver said, speaking for the first time since they had departed Penzance. "Landlord's name is Tregarth. He'll see you right enough." There was something in his tone, however, that suggested doubt, and he accepted the coins Holmes offered him with a grunt that might have been thanks, or might have been warning, then drove away without further word, his horse's hoofs striking sparks from the wet cobblestones. The 3 of them stood for a moment in the rain, their luggage at their feet, looking at the inn that would be their home for however long this investigation required. The building was old, its stones dark with age and damp, its windows small and set deep in thick walls. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, and from within came the muted sound of voices and the smell of cooking food, smoke and fish and bread, scents that spoke of warmth and life, in contrast to the cold greyness without. Holmes pushed open the door, and they entered a low-ceilinged common room, where a fire burned in a massive stone hearth, and perhaps a dozen men sat at rough wooden tables, their conversation dying the moment the strangers appeared. Watson felt the weight of their stares, felt himself being assessed and found suspicious, and he understood in that instant that Eleanor's brother had been right. This was a place where the outside world was not welcome, where visitors were tolerated at best, and watched always with wary, careful eyes. A man emerged from a doorway at the back of the room, tall and broad-shouldered, with iron grey hair and a face that might have been carved from the same stone as the buildings around them. "I am Tregarth," he said, his voice carrying the musical lilt of the Cornish accent. "You'll be wanting rooms, I expect." "Indeed," Holmes replied, his manner easy and confident, giving no sign that he felt the hostility radiating from the watching fisherman. "3 rooms, if you have them, for myself, my colleague Dr. Watson, and Miss Ashford here. We expect to be staying for several days, possibly longer." Tregarth's eyes moved from Holmes to Watson to Eleanor, lingering on her with an expression Watson could not quite read, something between recognition and concern. "We don't get many visitors this time of year," he he said slowly. Most folk have better sense than to come to Pendower when the storms are setting in. Nonetheless, we are here, and we require accommodation. Holmes produced several coins from his pocket, more than would be needed for a week's lodging, and laid them on the bar with a soft chime that seemed to echo in the now silent room. I trust this will be sufficient. Tregarth looked at the coins, then back at Holmes, and something shifted in his expression. Some calculation made and accepted. Aye, that'll do. Rooms are upstairs, 2nd floor. I'll have my wife bring up hot water for washing. Supper will be served in an hour, if you've a mind for it. Most kind, Holmes said, gathering the heavy iron keys Tregarth produced from beneath the bar. Tell me, is there someone in the village who might provide us with a guide to the local area? We are interested in the antiquities hereabout, the ancient sites and such. The silence in the room deepened, became something almost solid, almost tangible, and Watson saw several of the fishermen exchange glances that spoke volumes without words. Tregarth's face had gone carefully blank, the kind of blankness that was itself a form of expression. That would be the headland you're meaning, Tregarth said at last, where the scholar man was digging before he went away. I'd advise against going up there, especially with night coming on. It's not a safe place, not a welcoming place. The old stones, they don't take kindly to being disturbed. Eleanor stepped forward then, her voice steady, despite the tremor Watson could see in her hands. That scholar man was my brother, Thomas Ashford, and he did not simply go away. He disappeared, and I have come to find out what happened to him. The effect of her words was immediate and profound. Every man in the room seemed to draw back slightly, and Watson saw several make small gestures with their hands, quick movements that might have been warding signs against evil. Tregarth's face remained impassive, but his eyes had taken on a quality of deep sadness, almost of pity. "Then you're a braver soul than most, miss," he said quietly, "or a more foolish one. Either way, you'll find no guide in Pendower who'll take you to the headland willingly. Those who know what's good for them stay away from that cursed place. Stay away from the stones and the graves, and all that should have remained buried and forgotten." He turned then and walked back through the doorway from which he had emerged, leaving them standing in the centre of the common room, while the fishermen watched with eyes that held no warmth, no welcome, only a kind of grim knowledge, as though they knew already how this story would end, and mourned the inevitability of it, even as they judged the strangers for their folly. Holmes gathered their keys and gestured toward the stairs, and they climbed in silence to the 2nd floor, where narrow corridors smelling of beeswax and old wood led to small rooms, barely large enough for a bed and washstand. Watson saw Eleanor safely to her quarters, then found his own chamber next door, a spare space with a single window looking out over the harbour, where the fishing boats rocked in their restless sleep, and the rain continued its endless falling, whispering against the glass like voices from the deep, speaking in tongues no living person could understand. Night fell over Pendower like a curtain drawn by invisible hands, swift and absolute. The kinds, swift and absolute. The kind of darkness that belonged to places where electric lights had never been strung and gas lamps had never been installed, where the only illumination came from hearth fires and candles and the cold, distant stars when clouds permitted their viewing. In his small room at the Mariner's Rest, Watson stood at the window, watching the last traces of grey fade from the western sky. watching the fishing boats in the harbour become mere suggestions of shape against darker water, watching the village itself transform into a scattered constellation of yellow points, each one marking a human dwelling, a small fortress of warmth against the immensity of the surrounding dark. He had washed away the grime of travel, changed into fresh clothes, and now found himself reluctant to leave the relative sanctuary of his room, though he knew supper would be served soon, and Holmes would expect him to be present, observing, gathering impressions that might later prove significant. There was something about Pendower that unsettled him in ways he could not quite articulate, something that went beyond the obvious hostility of the villagers, or the wild remoteness of the location. It was as though the place itself exerted a pressure, a weight upon the spirit, making him feel watched even when he was quite alone. A knock at his door startled him from these brooding thoughts. Holmes entered without waiting for invitation, carrying in one hand a candle that cast wavering shadows across his angular features. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "I have been exploring our accommodations and have made several interesting observations. Also, it is time we descended for supper, and I am curious to see what intelligence might be gathered from observing our fellow guests." They collected Eleanor from her room, finding her pale but composed, and together descended the narrow stairs to the common room below. The space had emptied considerably since their arrival, only 5 or 6 men remaining, their conversation subdued, conducted in low voices that fell silent whenever one of the visitors drew near. Tregarth's wife, a small woman with work-worn hands and eyes that darted like nervous birds, served them supper at a table set apart from the others, near the fire, but somehow still feeling separate. Quarantined by invisible boundaries, the locals observed without question. The meal was simple but substantial. Fish stew, rich with potatoes and onions, bread still warm from the oven, butter yellow as autumn leaves, and small cups of cider that tasted of apples and earth, and something else Watson could not identify, some herb or spice that left a strange aftertaste upon the tongue. They ate in relative silence, aware of eyes upon them, aware that every gesture, every word exchanged, was being noted and would be discussed once they had retired for the night. When the meal was finished, and Tregarth's wife had cleared away their plates, Holmes leaned back in his chair and produced his pipe, filling it with tobacco from a worn leather pouch. He made no move to light it, however, merely held it between his teeth, as though the familiar weight and taste of the stem was comfort enough. His eyes roamed the room, taking in details that Watson knew he was cataloguing, with that remarkable memory of his, storing away impressions that would later be assembled into conclusions. "Mr. Tregarth," Holmes called across the room, his voice pleasant and conversational. "I wonder if you might spare us a moment of your time. We should like to ask you a few questions about the area, about the history of Pendower, and the sites of antiquarian interest nearby." Tregarth, who had been wiping down the bar with a cloth, paused in his work. For a moment, Watson thought he might refuse, might simply continue his task, and pretend not to have heard. But then he set down the cloth with obvious reluctance and approached their table, pulling out a chair and sitting with the air of a man preparing himself for an unpleasant duty. "I'll answer what I can," he said carefully. "Though I'll tell you now, there's much about this place that's not fit for outsiders to know, much that's better left alone." Holmes nodded as though this were the most reasonable statement in the world. Of course. We have no wish to pry into matters that do not concern us. Our interest is purely scholarly. Miss Ashford's brother was conducting excavations on the headland, as you know. Can you tell us when he first arrived in Pendower, and what sort of reception he received from the local people? Tregarth's face remained expressionless, but his hands, resting on the table before him, tightened almost imperceptibly. He came in late spring, May it was, when the weather was fair and the days were long, seemed a pleasant enough fellow, spoke respectfully, paid his way. He took a room here for a month, then moved his camp to the headland, when his work began in earnest. Some of the younger men helped him at first, carrying equipment, digging where he directed, but that didn't last long. Why not? Eleanor asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Tregarth turned his eyes to her, and Watson saw again that strange mixture of pity and judgment in his gaze. Because he started finding things that should have stayed hidden. Bones, miss. Human bones, hundreds of them, all marked with symbols, all arranged in patterns that spoke of old practices, old beliefs. The lads who'd been helping him, they wanted nothing more to do with it. They said the place was cursed, said your brother was disturbing something that would bring ruin on us all. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly piqued. These symbols on the bones, did anyone recognize them? Did they have meaning to the local people? For a long moment, Tregarth did not answer. The fire popped and crackled behind them, sending up a shower of sparks. And somewhere in the building, a door creaked slowly on its hinges, before closing with a soft thud that echoed through the walls. The landlord seemed to be wrestling with himself, deciding how much to reveal, how much to keep locked behind the wall of local reticence. There are old families in Pendower, he said at last, his voice so low that Watson had to strain to hear him over the crackling fire. Families that have lived here since before the Romans, since before the Druids even, or so the stories go. They keep the old knowledge, the old ways. They tend the sacred places, make the offerings that need making, speak the words that keep things balanced. Your brother, miss, he stumbled onto one of their holy sites, one of the places where the boundary between this world and the next grows thin. And he did more than stumble. He dug, he catalogued, he removed things that were never meant to leave that ground. Are you saying my brother was killed by these old families? Eleanor's voice had risen, drawing sharp glances from the few remaining patrons at the other tables. That they murdered him to protect their secrets? I'm saying nothing of the sort, Tregarth replied, standing abruptly. I'm saying he was warned and didn't heed the warning. I'm saying he kept digging after any sensible man would have stopped. What happened to him after? Well, that's not for me to say. But I'll tell you this. The headland is no place for the living after dark. Strange lights are seen there, strange sounds heard, and those who go up after sunset don't always come down again, or if they do, they're not quite the same as when they went up. He turned and walked away then, back to his position behind the bar, and it was clear from his posture that no further questions would be entertained. The remaining patrons finished their drinks with sudden haste and filed out into the night, casting final glances at the visitors that held no warmth, no curiosity, only a grim certainty that seemed to say, you have been warned, and what comes next is on your own heads. When they were alone, save for Tregarth's wife, clearing the last of the dishes in near silence. Holmes stood and gestured for Watson and Eleanor to follow him. They climbed the stairs once more, but instead of retiring to their separate rooms, Holmes led them to his own chamber, which was slightly larger than the others, and had the advantage of a small table and 2 additional chairs. Once inside with the door firmly closed, Holmes began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back, his expression intense. "We are dealing with something far more complex than a simple disappearance," he said, speaking more to himself than to his companions. "There is a conspiracy of silence here, a collective agreement to know nothing, see nothing, speak nothing. But underneath that silence, there is fear, genuine, bone-deep fear." He paused at the window, looking out into darkness so complete it seemed to press against the glass like a living thing. "Tomorrow we must visit the excavation site. We must see what Thomas Ashford uncovered, examine the evidence with our own eyes. But tonight—" He turned back to face them, and in the candlelight his features seemed sharper somehow, more hawkish. "Tonight, I suggest we remain indoors, keep our doors locked, and sleep lightly. I do not think we are in immediate physical danger, but I would not stake my life on that assumption." Watson saw Eleanor shiver despite the relative warmth of the room. "Do you believe what Tregarth said?" she asked. "About the old families, the sacred places?" Holmes considered this carefully before responding. "I believe that the people of Pendower believe it, which amounts to very nearly the same thing. Belief shapes behavior, Watson would tell you, having served in regions where local superstitions held sway over supposedly rational men. Whether there is any objective truth to these tales of old ways and thin boundaries, that remains to be determined. But I will tell you this. Someone is working very hard to make it appear that supernatural forces are at play. The question is why." A sound from somewhere below made all 3 of them freeze. It was a low, rhythmic chanting, barely audible, rising up through the floorboards, as though the earth itself were singing. The words, if they were words, were in no language Watson recognized, and the melody, if it could be called that, had a quality that made the hair on the back of his neck stand erect. It lasted perhaps 30 seconds, then ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt somehow thicker, more oppressive than before. "What in God's name was that?" Watson whispered, finding his hand had moved unconsciously to where his service revolver would have been, had he been carrying it. Holmes's expression was unreadable. That, Watson, was either a very effective piece of theatre designed to unnerve us, or it was something rather more disturbing. Either way, I think we have learned what we can for tonight. Let us retire to our respective rooms, lock our doors, and attempt to get what rest we can. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, and we shall need clear heads to face them. They parted in the corridor outside Holmes's room, each moving to their own chamber, with backward glances and heightened awareness of every shadow, every creak, every whisper of wind through gaps in the old building's walls. Watson locked his door, checked the window latch twice, and sat for a long while on the edge of his narrow bed, listening to the sounds of the inn settling for the night, the groan of wood and stone, the scurry of mice in the walls, and underneath it all, so faint he might have imagined it, the distant pulse of the sea throwing itself against rocks that had withstood its violence since the beginning of time. He thought of Thomas Ashford, alone at his excavation site, digging deeper into mysteries that the living were meant to leave buried. He thought of bones marked with symbols, of parcels delivered with messages written in blood-tinged ink, of a sister's desperate hope that her brother might still live. And he thought of the darkness beyond his window, complete and patient, waiting with the indifference of centuries for the small human dramas playing out within its embrace to reach their inevitable conclusions. Sleep, when it finally came, was troubled and thin, populated by dreams of standing stones and empty graves, of symbols that writhed like living things, of voices chanting in languages dead before history began. And through it all, the sound of the sea, eternal and pitiless, grinding stone to sand and sand to nothing, erasing all traces, keeping all secrets, remembering everything and revealing nothing to those who dared to ask. The cry of gulls woke Watson from dreams he could not quite remember, though they left behind a residue of unease, that clung to him like morning mist. He lay still for several moments, disoriented, his eyes tracing the unfamiliar ceiling beams above him, before memory returned and he recalled where he was and why. The room was grey with pre-dawn light filtering through the small window, and the sounds of the waking village drifted up from below. The creak of doors, the slap of boots on wet stone, voices calling to one another in the distinctive Cornish accent that made even ordinary conversation sound like incantation. He rose and dressed in the chill air, his breath visible in small clouds, and splashed cold water from the basin across his face to shock away the lingering cobwebs of troubled sleep. When he descended to the common room, he found Holmes already there, seated at the same table they had occupied the previous evening, a pot of tea steaming before him, and several pages of notes spread across the scarred wood. His friend looked as though he had not slept at all, his eyes bright with that particular intensity that meant his mind had been working through the night, assembling facts, testing theories, building and discarding explanations until one emerged that satisfied his exacting standards. "Good morning, Watson," Holmes said, without looking up from his notes. "I trust you slept better than I did, though given the circumstances, that is perhaps a low bar to clear. Come, have some tea. It is surprisingly good for such a remote establishment, and you will need fortification for what lies ahead today." Watson poured himself a cup and sat, warming his hands on the hot china, letting the steam carry its subtle perfume toward his face. "You have been planning our approach to the excavation site, I take it?" "Indeed. I have been considering the matter from several angles, and I believe we must proceed with considerable caution. The hostility we encountered last evening was not merely the suspicion that remote communities often display toward outsiders. There was something more deliberate about it, more organized. I suspect that our arrival was expected, that news of our coming preceded us, and that certain individuals are very keen to ensure we discover nothing of substance." Before Watson could respond, Eleanor appeared at the foot of the stairs, looking pale but determined, her dark travelling cloak already fastened about her shoulders. "I am ready," she said simply, "ready to see where Thomas worked, where he made his final discoveries, ready to know the truth, whatever that truth might be." They breakfasted on bread and cheese and cold ham, simple fare but adequate, while Tregarth watched them from behind his bar with an expression that might have been concern or might have been calculation. The few fishermen present in the common room pointedly ignored them, focusing on their own meals with exaggerated attention. But Watson could feel the weight of awareness pressing down upon them, the knowledge that every movement, every word was being noted and would be reported. When they had finished eating, Holmes rose and approached Tregarth directly. "We shall be walking up to the headland this morning to examine the excavation site. I assume there is a path." Tregarth set down the glass he had been polishing. "There is. Follows the old coast road north from the village, then branches off toward the summit. You cannot miss it. But I'll tell you again what I told you last night. You'd be wise to reconsider. That place has a bad reputation, earned over many years. People who go up there uninvited tend to regret it." "Your concern is noted and appreciated," Holmes replied with careful courtesy. "Nevertheless, we must see the site for ourselves. We shall take all reasonable precautions." They left the inn shortly thereafter, stepping out into a morning that was cold and damp, though the rain had temporarily ceased, leaving behind a world wrapped in layers of mist that clung to every surface and reduced visibility to a matter of yards. The village appeared and disappeared around them as they walked, buildings looming suddenly out of the greyness, and then fading again into obscurity. And Watson had the unsettling sensation of walking through a place that existed only partially, as though Pendower inhabited some liminal space between the solid world and without context. Watson's voice seemed to hang in the mist for a long moment before Holmes stirred, lifting his head slowly, as though returning from some great distance, some deep place of concentration, where the outside world existed only as a distant whisper. He looked up at Watson and Eleanor, standing at the edge of the excavation, his face expressionless in a way that Watson had learned to recognize as the mask his friend wore when confronted with something that disturbed him profoundly, something that challenged his fundamental understanding of the world's workings. "Come down," Holmes said quietly, his voice oddly flat, stripped of its usual decisive confidence. "Come down and see what Thomas Ashford discovered. Come down and understand why he disappeared." Watson descended first, using the crude steps cut into the earth, his boots slipping slightly on soil that remained damp despite weeks without rain, as though the ground here refused to dry, refused to relinquish the moisture it had absorbed. Eleanor followed close behind him, one hand braced against the wall of raw earth, the other clutching her skirts to keep them from the mud. The temperature dropped noticeably as they descended, a chill that had nothing to do with the sea wind and everything to do with the nature of deep places, of spaces that sunlight rarely touched, where the warmth of the living world could not easily penetrate. The chamber at the bottom was larger than it had appeared from above, perhaps 12 feet in diameter, with walls of carefully fitted stone that curved inward to form a dome overhead. The craftsmanship was remarkable, each stone shaped and placed with precision, the joints so tight that Watson could not have slipped a knife blade between them. The floor was paved with flat stones arranged in a spiral pattern that drew the eye inexorably toward the center, where Holmes now stood, his lantern raised to illuminate what lay at his feet. It was a stone altar, or perhaps a burial slab, rectangular and massive, its surface carved with an intricate network of symbols that seemed to flow and connect in ways that suggested meaning just beyond Watson's ability to grasp. The stone was stained dark in places, and Watson's medical training allowed him to recognize the distinctive pattern of old bloodstains, centuries old perhaps, but unmistakable in their configuration. Around the altar's base, arranged with clear deliberation, were bones. Human bones, dozens of them, each one marked with the same symbols they had seen on Eleanor's parcels, each one placed with ritualistic precision. But it was what lay upon the altar itself that had caught Holmes's attention so completely. A leather-bound journal, recent and familiar, its pages swollen with damp, lay open as though someone had been reading it moments before. Beside it, a small wooden box, elaborately carved, stood with its lid thrown back to reveal contents that glinted in the lantern light. And scattered across the stone surface like fallen petals were more cards, yellowed and stained, covered in the same spidery script they had seen before. Thomas's journal, Eleanor breathed, stepping forward with trembling hands outstretched. That is my brother's journal. I would know his handwriting anywhere. Holmes caught her wrist gently but firmly before she could touch anything. Not yet, Miss Ashford. This is a crime scene, or, at minimum, a scene of considerable evidential importance. We must examine everything systematically, document its position and condition before we disturb anything. Watson, your notebook, if you please. Watson produced his notebook and pencil, his hands surprisingly steady, despite the strangeness of their surroundings, despite the feeling of wrongness that permeated this place like a bad smell, like the taste of metal on the tongue before a storm. He began to sketch the layout of the chamber, noting the position of each significant object, while Holmes conducted his examination with the meticulous care that characterized all his investigations. Holmes lifted the journal carefully, supporting it from beneath, and carried it to where the light was strongest. He turned pages with delicate precision, his eyes scanning the text rapidly, occasionally pausing to read a passage more carefully. Watson could see his friend's expression shifting subtly as he read, concern deepening into something approaching alarm, though Holmes remained silent, absorbing the information before sharing his conclusions. Minutes passed in this manner, the only sounds the whisper of turning pages and the distant cry of seabirds wheeling somewhere above them in the grey sky. The mist seemed to press closer around the excavation, as though trying to peer in at them, to see what secrets they were uncovering in this hidden chamber beneath the earth. Finally, Holmes looked up, and Watson saw in his eyes something he had rarely witnessed there: genuine uncertainty, a suggestion that perhaps not everything could be explained through reason and deduction, that perhaps the world contained mysteries that resisted rational analysis. Thomas Ashford was a careful observer, Holmes began, his voice measured and thoughtful. His notes are detailed, methodical, exactly what one would expect from a scholar of his reputation. He documents his excavation procedures, his discoveries, his interpretations with admirable precision. But as the weeks progress, his entries become troubled. He writes of finding this chamber 3 weeks before he disappeared, of realizing that it was not merely a burial site, but something else, something actively maintained. He notes evidence of recent use: candles burned down to stubs, fresh flowers left as offerings, bones that had been rearranged since his previous visit. Holmes turned several more pages, his finger tracing a particular passage. Here, dated August 15th, he writes, "I am being watched constantly now, not by the villagers, though they are hostile enough, but by something else, something I glimpse only at the edge of vision. shapes moving between the stones at twilight, figures that vanish when I look directly at them. I tell myself it is merely my imagination, fatigue playing tricks with my perception. But my equipment has been tampered with, tools moved, notes disturbed. Someone comes here when I am not present, someone who knows what this place represents and does not want me here. A sudden sound made all three of them start violently. A cascade of small stones and earth sliding down the wall of the excavation, pattering onto the chamber floor like rain. They turned as one toward the source, but saw nothing, only the rough wall of soil and the crude steps leading upward toward the circle of grey sky visible above. The sound ceased as abruptly as it had begun, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before, weighted with unseen attention. Watson found his heart was racing, his breath coming faster, despite his efforts to maintain composure. Eleanor had gone pale, her hand pressed to her throat in a gesture of unconscious fear. Only Holmes seemed unaffected, or perhaps merely better at concealing his reaction, returning his attention to the journal as though nothing had occurred. The final entry, Holmes continued, his voice betraying no hint of concern about the falling earth, is dated September 18th, the day before Thomas Ashford was last seen alive. He writes, "I have made a discovery that changes everything. Beneath the altar stone is a hidden compartment, and within it I have found objects that suggest this site has been in continuous use, not for centuries, but for millennia. The implications are staggering. This is not merely an archaeological curiosity, but a living tradition, a practice that has persisted in secret despite conquest and conversion, despite every effort to erase it. I must document everything before." And there the entry ends, mid-sentence, the final words trailing off, as though he were interrupted, or perhaps as though something caused him to stop writing and put down his pen. Holmes closed the journal carefully and turned his attention to the wooden box. He lifted it from the altar and brought it closer to the lantern, and Watson could see now that the carvings on its surface were not merely decorative, but formed words in Latin, worn but legible. Ossa locuntur, mortui vivant, custos mane. The bones speak, the dead live, the keeper remains, Holmes translated softly. A motto, or perhaps a promise, or a warning. He opened the box fully, and Watson moved closer to see its contents. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, were three objects: a small knife with a bone handle, its blade tarnished but still sharp, a silver chain from which hung a pendant bearing symbols Watson now recognized from the stones and cards, and a folded piece of parchment, ancient and fragile, that crackled softly when Holmes lifted it with careful fingers. The parchment was covered in text written in a dense, crabbed hand, the ink brown with age. Holmes studied it intently, his lips moving slightly as he worked through the archaic language. "It is a ritual instruction," he said at last, "a guide for the keeper of bones, describing how the dead must be honored, how their remains must be marked and arranged to maintain the covenant between the living and those who have passed beyond. It speaks of duties that must be performed each season, offerings that must be made, words that must be spoken to keep the balance, to prevent." He paused, rereading a section with a frown. "To prevent the dead from walking, from seeking what was taken from them, from reclaiming what they believe is rightfully theirs." The wind rose suddenly, whistling through the standing stones above with a sound like voices raised in lamentation. The mist swirled and thickened, reducing the circle of sky visible from the chamber to a narrow disk of grey light. Watson felt the temperature drop further, felt his breath misting before him in visible clouds, and he pulled his coat tighter, though he knew the cold he felt came from within as much as from without, a chill born of understanding, that they had stumbled into something far older and stranger than any of them had imagined. Eleanor's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible. Then my brother discovered this ritual, this tradition that has persisted for thousands of years, and someone wanted to stop him from revealing it, someone who still practices these rites, who still believes in their necessity. More than that, Holmes replied, setting down the parchment with exquisite care. I believe your brother was not merely silenced, but was perhaps taken, claimed, if you will, by those who see themselves as the legitimate keepers of this knowledge. The parcels you received, the bones marked with symbols, they were not threats, but rather demonstrations, proof that the ritual continues, that the covenant is being maintained. He picked up one of the cards scattered on the altar, holding it to the light. The bones remember, he read aloud. He disturbed the rest. The collection grows. You should not have come seeking. We keep what we gather. These are not the words of simple murderers covering their tracks, Watson. These are the words of believers, of individuals who see themselves as performing a sacred duty, maintaining an ancient practice that they believe protects the community, that keeps something terrible at bay. Watson moved to the edge of the chamber, looking up at the narrow opening above, suddenly aware of how vulnerable they were down here, how easily they could be trapped if someone were to fill in the excavation, or even merely to block the entrance with stones. The thought sent a spike of panic through him, and he had to force himself to breathe slowly, to remind himself that they had encountered no direct threat, that the inhabitants of Pendower, while hostile, had done nothing overtly harmful. But even as he tried to reassure himself, he became aware of something new, a sound so faint at first that he thought he might be imagining it. It was a rhythmic noise, distant but growing gradually closer, the measured tread of many feet moving in unison across the summit of the headland. With the sound came voices, low and chanting, words in a language that was not English, that might not have been any modern language at all, but something older, something that carried in its syllables the weight of ages and the power of belief sustained across generations. Holmes heard it too, his head snapping up, his body tensing like a hound catching a scent. "We have visitors," he said quietly, extinguishing the lantern with a quick puff of breath. "And I suspect they are not pleased to find us here. Watson, help Miss Ashford up the steps. We need to see who approaches and determine whether they come with peaceful intent or otherwise." They scrambled up the crude steps as quickly as caution allowed, emerging onto the summit just as the mist parted like curtains being drawn back, revealing a sight that would remain etched in Watson's memory for the rest of his days. Approaching from the direction of the village, moving between the standing stones with solemn purpose, came a procession of perhaps 20 figures, all dressed in long robes of rough grey cloth, their faces hidden by deep hoods, their hands clasped before them as they chanted in that strange, ancient tongue. At the head of the procession walked a single figure, taller than the others, carrying a staff carved with symbols and crowned with what appeared to be a human skull, polished white and gleaming even in the dim light. This figure raised the staff high as the procession came to a halt, perhaps 30 feet from where Watson, Holmes, and Eleanor stood frozen at the edge of the excavation, caught between the instinct to flee and the compulsion to stand their ground, to face whatever came with courage, if not with confidence. The chanting ceased abruptly, and in the sudden silence, the tall figure spoke, its voice deep and resonant, carrying clearly across the space between them. You have trespassed upon sacred ground. You have disturbed what should remain at rest. You have opened what should remain sealed. The covenant has been broken, and the price must be paid. The staff crowned with bone struck the earth 3 times, each impact sending a dull thud across the summit that seemed to resonate not merely in the air, but within Watson's chest, within his very bones, as though his body itself were becoming an instrument played by forces he could neither see nor comprehend. The sound echoed between the standing stones, multiplying and returning from different directions, until it seemed the entire headland was speaking with one voice, pronouncing judgment upon those who had dared to venture where they did not belong. Holmes stepped forward then, positioning himself slightly ahead of Watson and Eleanor, his posture neither aggressive nor submissive, but rather that of a man prepared to engage in reasoned discourse, to meet irrationality with logic and fear with calm determination. His voice, when he spoke, carried across the space between them with surprising authority, cutting through the lingering echoes of the staff's proclamation. "We mean no disrespect to your traditions," Holmes began, his words measured and clear. "We come seeking a man who disappeared from this place, seeking truth and understanding, not to violate your sacred spaces, or to disrupt practices that have been maintained across centuries. I am Sherlock Holmes, and my companions are Dr. Watson and Miss Eleanor Ashford, sister to the scholar Thomas Ashford, who worked at this site before he vanished. Surely you can understand her need to know what became of her brother, to have answers that might grant her peace." The tall figure remained motionless for a long moment, the skull atop its staff staring with empty sockets toward the 3 visitors, its jaw slightly open as though frozen in an eternal scream, or perhaps an eternal laugh, mocking the living who stood before it. The other robed figures stood equally still, arrayed in a semicircle behind their leader, silent and watchful, their faces hidden in shadow so deep that Watson could not tell if they were young or old, male or female, even whether they were truly looking at the visitors or staring at nothing at all. When the tall figure finally spoke again, its voice had changed somehow, become less threatening and more weary, carrying in its tones the weight of responsibility long borne, of duties performed without respite, across the turning of seasons and the passage of years. "You speak of understanding, detective, but you understand nothing. You come from a world of gaslight and engines, of books and laboratories, where everything can be measured and catalogued and explained. But this place belongs to a different world, one that existed before your civilization, and will exist long after it has crumbled to dust and been forgotten." The figure lowered its staff slowly, and with the other hand reached up to push back the deep hood, revealing a face that made Eleanor gasp audibly. It was a woman, perhaps 60 years of age, her features weathered by wind and time, but still handsome, her eyes grey as winter sea, and holding within them a depth of knowledge and sorrow that Watson found difficult to meet directly. There was something in those eyes that spoke of things witnessed that could not be unwitnessed, of prices paid that could never be refunded. "I am called Morwenna," the woman said, and now her voice, freed from the concealment of the hood, revealed traces of education beneath the Cornish accent, suggesting someone who had moved between worlds, who knew both the old ways and the new. "I am the keeper of bones, as my mother was before me, and her mother before her, back through generations beyond counting. This is my burden and my honor, to maintain the covenant between the living and the dead, to ensure that what was done in darkness remains in darkness, that what was sealed remains sealed." She gestured with the staff toward the excavation behind Watson and his companions. "Your brother, Miss Ashford, he came to this place with good intentions, with scholarly interest, with a desire to understand the past. But he could not leave well enough alone. He found the chamber, yes, but he did more than merely document what lay within. He removed artifacts, bones that had been consecrated and placed according to ancient strictures. He broke the pattern, disrupted the arrangement, violated the covenant, and for that the price had to be paid." "What price?" Eleanor's voice cracked with emotion, with the terrible knowledge of what answer might come. "What have you done with my brother? Where is Thomas?" Morwenna's expression softened slightly, and Watson saw in her face a genuine sympathy, a recognition of Eleanor's pain that seemed at odds with her earlier pronouncements. "Your brother lives, child. He lives, though perhaps not in the manner you might have expected. When he broke the covenant, when he removed what should not have been removed, the balance was upset. The dead began to wake, to stir in their long sleep, reaching toward the world of light from which they had been excluded for so long. Something had to be done. Someone had to stand in the gap, to take the place of what was lost." Holmes had been listening with complete attention, his sharp mind clearly working to parse meaning from words that seemed designed to obscure as much as they revealed. "You are saying that Thomas Ashford was taken as a replacement, a substitute for the bones he removed, that he now serves some function within your ritual framework." "Not taken," Morwenna corrected, her voice firm. "Chosen. Or rather, he chose, though he did not know he was choosing, when he opened the sealed chamber, when he touched what should not have been touched. The ritual is older than language, older than any religion you might name. It requires a keeper, yes, but it also requires offerings, not of blood, not of violence, but of presence, of those who willingly or unwillingly commit themselves to maintaining the boundary between what is and what might be." She began to walk slowly toward them, and the other robed figures moved with her, maintaining their semicircular formation, their movements synchronized with unsettling precision. Watson's hand moved instinctively to his walking stick, gripping it with sudden tension, preparing for whatever might come. But Holmes placed a hand on his arm, a gentle gesture of restraint, of trust that words might still accomplish what force could not. Morwenna stopped a few paces away, close enough that Watson could see the fine lines etched around her eyes, the silver threads woven through her dark hair, the weathering of her hands where they gripped the bone-crowned staff. She studied each of them in turn, her gaze lingering longest on Eleanor, and Watson thought he saw tears gathering at the corners of her grey eyes, though whether from emotion or from the bite of the sea wind he could not say. "Come," she said at last, gesturing back toward the circle of standing stones. "Come and see what your brother has become. Come and understand what it means to serve the covenant, to stand guard over mysteries that the living were never meant to fully comprehend. But know this: once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Once you have understood, you cannot unknow. The burden of this knowledge will stay with you until your final breath, and perhaps beyond. Holmes glanced at Watson, a question in his eyes, and Watson gave a slight nod, understanding that they had come too far to turn back now, that answers waited just ahead and must be confronted regardless of what form those answers might take. Eleanor was already moving forward, drawn by the desperate need to know her brother's fate, pulled by bonds of blood and love that could not be denied. They followed Morwenna and her silent companions through the standing stones, which seemed to lean inward as they passed, creating a corridor of ancient rock that channeled them toward the far side of the summit, where the land dropped away in steep cliffs toward the restless sea below. The mist had thickened again, or perhaps they were walking into clouds that hung low over the headland, for visibility shrank to mere feet, and each step forward felt like a step into uncertainty, into realms where the familiar rules of the world might no longer apply. The ground beneath their feet changed, became smoother, more deliberately shaped, and Watson realized they were walking on paved stones, a path that had been laid down long ago and maintained through whatever rites and labours the keepers performed. The path wound between smaller stones, marker stones perhaps, each one carved with symbols that seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. Though Watson knew this must be mere reflection, mere trick of moisture and shadow, playing upon ancient inscriptions. They emerged from the mist into a space that seemed to exist apart from the world they had just left. A natural amphitheatre formed by a ring of cliff walls, open to the sky above and to the sea beyond, where waves crashed against rocks with a violence that sent spray high into the air, misting everything with salt and cold. At the centre of this space stood a structure unlike anything Watson had seen before, a circular building of unmortared stone, its walls perhaps 10 feet high, its roof a dome of layered slate that seemed to grow organically from the underlying rock. Morwenna approached the structure's single entrance, a low doorway that would require even Watson to stoop to pass through, and there she paused, turning to face them one final time. "Beyond this threshold," she said, her voice barely audible above the crash of waves, "lies the true heart of the covenant, the inner sanctum where the keeper performs the rites that maintain the balance. Your brother Thomas works there now, has worked there every day since he accepted his role. He tends the bones, speaks the words, makes the offerings. He remembers the dead so that they might remain at rest. He gives of himself so that the living might remain safe." Before anyone could respond, before Eleanor could cry out, or Holmes could pose another careful question, the robed figures moved with sudden, coordinated purpose. They surrounded the three visitors, not threatening, but unmistakably preventing retreat, herding them gently but firmly toward the doorway where Morwenna waited. Watson felt hands on his arms, on his back, pressure that was not violent, but was absolutely insistent, and he allowed himself to be guided forward, understanding that resistance now would accomplish nothing but injury or flight, and flight would leave all questions unanswered. The doorway swallowed them one by one, Holmes first, then Eleanor, then Watson, each of them ducking through the low opening and straightening to find themselves in a space dimly lit by candles burning in niches carved into the walls. The interior was larger than the exterior had suggested, either by trick of architecture or by some quality of the space itself that seemed to expand to accommodate those who entered. The floor was decorated with that same spiral pattern they had seen in the excavation chamber, but here it was executed in different coloured stones, creating a hypnotic effect that drew the eye inward, downward, toward the centre, where a figure knelt before an altar covered in bones. The figure wore robes similar to those of Morwenna and her companions, grey and rough, but even before he turned, even before his face became visible in the uncertain candlelight, Eleanor made a sound that was half sob, half cry of recognition. She surged forward, breaking free from the gentle restraint of the robed figures, rushing across the spiral floor toward the kneeling man. "Thomas," she cried, her voice breaking on his name. "Thomas, oh God, Thomas, you are alive." The man stood slowly, turning to face her, and Watson saw that it was indeed Thomas Ashford, recognizable from the photographs Eleanor had shown them, though changed in ways subtle and profound. His face was thinner, his eyes holding that same depth of knowledge and sorrow that Watson had seen in Morwenna's gaze, his hands marked with symbols, drawn in what might have been ink, or might have been something else, patterns that wrapped around his fingers and palms like living gloves of ancient script. He caught Eleanor as she threw herself into his arms, but his embrace was hesitant, almost reluctant, and when he spoke, his voice carried a distance that suggested he was not entirely present, not fully the brother she remembered. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I knew you would come. I tried to warn you away, tried to make you understand through the parcels, through the messages. But I knew you would come regardless. You were always too brave, too determined to let mysteries remain unsolved." He held her at arm's length then, looking into her face with terrible sadness. "You should not have come, sister. This knowledge was not meant for you. But now that you are here, now that you have passed the threshold, there is no turning back. You have entered the covenant, and the covenant does not release those who come willingly into its embrace." Eleanor was weeping now, tears streaming down her face unchecked, her body shaking with the force of emotions too complex to name. Relief that her brother lived, horror at what he had become, grief for the relationship that could never be restored to what it was. She reached for him again, but Thomas stepped back, maintaining the distance he had created, and his expression held such profound sorrow that Watson felt his own throat tighten with sympathetic pain. "Let me explain," Thomas said, his voice steady, despite the emotion that clearly moved beneath its surface. "Let me tell you what happened after I found the sealed chamber, after I removed the bones that I believed were merely archaeological specimens, objects to be studied and catalogued and displayed in museums, where they might teach the world about ancient practices and forgotten beliefs. I did not understand, you see. I thought I was preserving history, when in fact I was destroying something far more important, far more necessary." He moved to the altar, his hands hovering over the bones, arranged there with such precision, such obvious care. "The covenant is not myth, Eleanor. It is not superstition or primitive fear disguised as religion. It is a practical arrangement, a bargain struck in ages beyond memory, between the living and the dead, between this world and whatever lies beyond the veil that separates one state of being from another. The bones you see here are not mere relics. They are anchors, points of connection that bind the dead to this place, that keep them from drifting, from seeking what they have lost, from returning to claim what was taken from them when they passed beyond life. Holmes had been listening intently, his analytical mind clearly working to understand what was being described, to find rational framework for concepts that seemed to defy rationality. "You are describing a kind of spiritual technology," he said slowly, "a system of ritual and belief that produces measurable effects, that maintains boundaries which might otherwise dissolve or become permeable. But surely you cannot expect us to accept this at face value, without evidence, without demonstration of what you claim." Thomas turned to face Holmes directly, and there was no anger in his expression, only a kind of tired patience, the look of someone who has tried to explain colour to the blind, or music to the deaf, and knows the impossibility of conveying direct experience through mere words. "What evidence would satisfy you, Mr. Holmes? What demonstration could prove what you have already decided is impossible? But very well. Watch." He reached into his robes and withdrew a small bone, marked with symbols Watson now recognized, and laid it carefully upon the altar in a space that had been left empty, completing a pattern that had been incomplete. The moment the bone touched stone, the air in the chamber changed. Watson felt it as a pressure in his ears, a heaviness in his lungs, as though the atmosphere had suddenly become denser, charged with some invisible energy that made the hair on his arms stand erect and sent a shiver down his spine. Despite the relative warmth of the enclosed space, the candles flared brighter, their flames reaching upward with sudden intensity, and shadows that had been merely shadows began to move with purpose, to coalesce and take on suggestion of form, of shapes that might have been human, or might have been something else, something that had never been human and never would be. Watson heard Eleanor gasp, felt her press closer to him, and he placed a protective arm around her shoulders, while his other hand gripped his walking stick with white-knuckled force. A sound filled the chamber, low and vibrating, something between music and speech, words that might have been language, or might have been the earth itself, groaning with the weight of ages, with the burden of all that had died, and all that yet lived upon its surface. The sound seemed to come from the bones themselves, from the very stones of the building, from the air and from the ground, and from the darkest corners where candlelight could not reach. Then Thomas lifted the bone from the altar, breaking the pattern, and instantly the phenomena ceased. The candles returned to their normal burning, the shadows became mere shadows once more. The sound faded to silence. The chamber felt suddenly ordinary again, merely a room built of stone where people performed rituals of remembrance. Nothing more supernatural than any church or temple where the faithful gathered to honor their beliefs. "The dead are always close," Thomas said quietly, replacing the bone in his robes. "They press against the boundaries that separate their realm from ours, seeking warmth, seeking light, seeking the life they have lost. The covenant maintains those boundaries through constant vigilance, through offerings not of blood, but of attention, of remembrance, of acknowledgement that they existed, and that their existence meant something. The bones are marked with their names, with symbols that describe who they were, what they valued, how they should be remembered, and the keeper speaks those names, tells those stories, maintains the connection that keeps them satisfied, that prevents them from breaking through." He moved toward Eleanor again, and this time she did not reach for him, but stood very still, tears still streaming down her face, but her expression one of growing understanding, of terrible comprehension of what her brother had sacrificed, what he continued to sacrifice each day he remained in this place. When I removed the bones from the chamber, I broke the pattern, and that night, Eleanor, such things happened as I cannot fully describe. I woke in my tent to find it surrounded by shapes, by presences that had no physical form, but were nonetheless real, undeniably present. They did not threaten, but their very existence was threat enough. I knew, without being told, that I had done something terrible, something that could not simply be undone by returning what I had taken. A sudden gust of wind struck the building, sending spray from the sea crashing against the stone walls with such force that water seeped through cracks in the dome overhead, dripping down in cold trails that hissed when they struck the candles. The flames wavered but did not go out, maintained by whatever properties the candles possessed, or whatever protections the chamber held. Outside, the storm that had been building all day was arriving in earnest, and Watson could hear the roar of wind and wave combining into a sound like great engines grinding, like the voice of something vast and indifferent announcing its presence. Thomas waited for the noise to subside before continuing. Morwenna found me the next morning, barely conscious, terrified beyond any fear I had known, even in my darkest nightmares. She explained what I had done, what needed to be done to restore the balance. The previous keeper had died the winter before, and they had been conducting the rites collectively, sharing the burden among all who knew the ways. But the ritual works best with a single keeper, one person who can devote themselves completely to the work, who can learn the names and the stories and the proper arrangements. She offered me a choice: leave Pendower and never return, allowing the imbalance to continue and grow until the boundaries failed completely, or stay and take up the burden, become the new keeper and maintain what I had so carelessly disrupted. "And you chose to stay," Holmes said, and it was not a question, but a statement of fact, an acknowledgement of the only choice a man like Thomas Ashford could have made. A scholar who had spent his life pursuing truth, and who could not turn away from responsibility once he understood its weight. "I chose to stay," Thomas confirmed. "Not immediately. I wrestled with the decision for 3 days and 3 nights, barely sleeping, barely eating, trying to find some other solution, some way to restore what I had broken without surrendering my life to its maintenance. But there was no other way, and so I sent my final letter to Eleanor, with vague warnings I hoped would keep her from investigating too deeply. And then I disappeared from the world I had known, and entered this new one, this life of constant vigilance, of daily ritual, of speaking to the dead and listening to their silence." He looked at his sister with such love and such distance that Watson felt his heart might break from witnessing it. "The parcels I sent you were not meant to frighten Eleanor, though I feared they might. I wanted you to know I lived, that I was engaged in important work, that my disappearance had meaning and purpose. I marked the bones myself, practiced the symbols until I could carve them with the precision the ritual requires. I wanted you to understand, somehow, that I had found a calling, strange though it might be." Eleanor had stopped weeping, though her face remained wet with tears. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was hoarse but steady. "Then you will not come back with us. You will not return to London. to your old life, to the world that misses you? I cannot, Thomas said simply. The covenant requires a keeper, and I have accepted that role. To abandon it now would be to undo all that I have worked to restore, to allow the boundaries to fail, to invite catastrophe not only upon Pendower, but perhaps upon a much wider region. The dead are patient, Eleanor, but they are also persistent. If the rituals cease, if the names stop being spoken, if the bones are left untended, they will find their way through. And what happens then, I do not wish to know. Morwenna, who had been standing silently near the entrance throughout this exchange, stepped forward now. Your brother speaks truth, Miss Ashford. He has learned more in these few months than some keepers learn in years. He has a gift for the work, an affinity for understanding what the dead need, what words bring them peace. He has become invaluable to us, to the Covenant, but more than that, he has found purpose here, meaning that his scholarly work never quite provided. He is needed in ways he was never needed before. She turned to Holmes, her grey eyes assessing him with careful intelligence. You came seeking answers, detective, and now you have them. Thomas Ashford lives. He serves willingly, or as willingly as anyone can serve when confronted with impossible choices. No crime has been committed, no law broken. Will you respect what you have learned here? Will you honour the Covenant by keeping its secrets? Holmes was silent for a long moment, his face unreadable in the candlelight. Watson knew his friend well enough to recognise the struggle occurring behind that calm exterior, the battle between the part of Holmes that demanded truth be brought to light, and the part that recognised some truths were too dangerous, too destabilising to be widely known. Finally, slowly, Holmes nodded. I will keep your secrets, he said quietly, on the condition that Thomas Ashford is free to write to his sister, to maintain contact that will assure her of his well-being and allow her some measure of peace, and on the further condition that if he ever wishes to leave, if he ever finds the burden too great, he will be permitted to do so without consequence or coercion. Morwenna inclined her head in acknowledgement. Those conditions are acceptable. The Covenant binds by choice, not by force. Should Thomas ever wish to train another to take his place, that can be arranged, though I believe he will find, as most keepers do, that the work becomes less a burden and more a calling over time, that what seems sacrifice transforms gradually into satisfaction. Eleanor looked between her brother and the woman who had become his teacher, his guide into this strange new life, and Watson saw her shoulders sag with acceptance, with the release of hope she had carried for so long. She would never have her brother back, not truly, but she had him alive, had him engaged in work that mattered to him, had the promise of continued contact, even if that contact would always carry the ache of distance and difference. May I visit? She asked softly. May I come to Pendower from time to time, to see you, to know you are well? Thomas smiled then, the first genuine smile Watson had seen from him, and for a moment the weight of his office seemed to lift, allowing glimpses of the scholar and brother he had been to shine through. Yes, he said. Yes, you may visit, though I cannot promise stimulating conversation, for my thoughts are increasingly occupied with the dead and their concerns rather than the living and theirs. But yes, you may come. It would gladden my heart to see you, sister, to know the world beyond this place continues in its way. They spoke for a while longer, Eleanor and Thomas, Quiet words Watson did not strain to hear. Private communications between siblings who would now walk very different paths, but who remained connected by bonds that neither distance nor transformation could wholly sever. Holmes wandered the chamber, examining the bones and their arrangements with professional interest, occasionally making notes in his small book, but asking no more questions, respecting the limitations that had been established. Watson stood near the entrance, looking out through the narrow doorway at the storm that raged beyond, watching rain lash the stones and wind tear at the sparse vegetation that clung to life in this harsh place. He thought about mysteries and their solutions, about how some answers brought peace, while others brought only deeper questions. He thought about choices made in darkness and duties shouldered in silence, about the myriad ways human beings found meaning in a world that offered no inherent meaning, only opportunities to create purpose through action and commitment. When it was finally time to leave, when evening was beginning its descent toward night, and the storm showed signs of relenting, they emerged from the chamber to find the robed figures still waiting, patient as stones, ready to escort them back through the standing stones and down the path toward the village. Thomas walked with them as far as the edge of the summit, standing there with Morwenna at his side, like a priest and priestess of some ancient order, watching as the visitors departed their sacred precinct, orchestrating peaceful closure and philosophical reflection, closure and atmospheric transitions. The journey back to London unfolded in reverse, each mile carrying them away from the wild edges of Cornwall and toward the ordered familiarity of civilization, though Watson found the transition more difficult than he had anticipated, as though part of him remained behind on that windswept headland, still standing among the ancient stones, still listening to voices that spoke in languages older than memory. The train rattled eastward through landscapes that gradually softened, the stark cliffs and twisted trees giving way to gentler hills and orderly fields, the grey sky brightening incrementally until, somewhere past Exeter, actual sunlight broke through the clouds and laid golden fingers across the countryside, touching everything with warmth that felt almost foreign after days immersed in Pendow's perpetual gloom. Eleanor sat across from Watson in their compartment, her gaze fixed upon the window, but her eyes seeing nothing, or perhaps seeing everything, replaying the moments in that circular chamber where she had held her brother and then released him, where she had found what she sought and discovered it was both more and less than she had imagined. She had spoken little since their departure, retreating into private contemplation, and Watson respected her silence, understanding that some experiences required time to settle, to be examined and understood, and finally accepted as part of the strange tapestry of one's life. Holmes occupied himself with writing, his notebook open across his lap, his pen moving steadily across page after page as he documented everything they had witnessed, everything they had learned, creating a record that would likely never be published, never be shared beyond the three of them, but which satisfied his need to impose order upon chaos, to transform experience into narrative that could be examined and understood. Occasionally, he would pause, staring out at the window, with that distant expression Watson knew meant he was arranging thoughts, testing connections, building frameworks of understanding from fragments of evidence and impression. They stopped for luncheon at a small inn near Plymouth, stepping out onto a platform crowded with ordinary travellers engaged in ordinary pursuits, buying newspapers, greeting relatives, complaining about delays and weather with that peculiarly British blend of stoicism and petulance. The normalcy of it felt surreal, jarring, as though they had stepped from one world into another entirely, from a place where the dead pressed close and ancient covenants governed behaviour, into a place where the greatest concerns were train schedules and the price of tea. The inn served mutton stew and fresh bread, simple food but well prepared, and they ate in companionable silence at a table near a window overlooking the platform. Watson found himself studying the faces of other patrons, wondering what secrets they carried, what burdens they shouldered in private, while maintaining public faces of ordinariness and contentment. Everyone, he thought, everyone carries mysteries. Lives lived in layers, with only the surface visible to casual observation. A child at a nearby table knocked over a cup of milk, the white liquid spreading across the wooden surface in an expanding pool, while the mother scolded and the father dabbed ineffectually with a napkin, and the child began to cry with that particular intensity, unique to small disappointments, magnified by fatigue and hunger. The sound broke through Watson's reverie, snapping him back to the present moment, reminding him that life continued in all its messy complexity, that the profound and the mundane existed side by side, that cosmic mysteries did not prevent spilled milk or soothe crying children. Eleanor had been watching the small drama as well, and when she turned back to her companions, Watson saw that she was smiling slightly, the first genuine smile he had seen from her since the previous day. "Life persists," she said softly, "despite everything, despite mysteries and losses and transformations. Life simply continues. There is comfort in that, I think, in knowing that the world does not pause for our private sorrows, that somewhere a child is crying over spilled milk, while we wrestle with questions of life and death, and duties that transcend individual desire." "There is comfort," Holmes agreed, setting down his teacup with deliberate care. "And there is also challenge. The challenge of holding both realities simultaneously, of understanding that ancient covenants and crying children are equally real, equally demanding of our attention and respect. We live in a world more complex than most people imagine, Watson, full of layers and dimensions that intersect and influence one another in ways we are only beginning to comprehend." They boarded the train again as afternoon was settling toward evening, the sun beginning its slow decline toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed impossibly beautiful after days of grey. The compartment was warm, the motion of the train soothing, and Watson felt his eyelids growing heavy, despite having slept reasonably well the previous night at the Mariner's Rest, in that small room where rain had whispered against the window, and wind had sung through gaps in the walls, like voices from far away, speaking words he could almost but not quite understand. Eleanor had finally begun to speak, her voice low and thoughtful, sharing observations about her brother that helped Watson understand the man who had chosen to remain in Pendower, to accept the burden of becoming Keeper of Bones. She spoke of Thomas's childhood fascination with history, with understanding how people had lived in ages past, what they had believed and valued and feared. She spoke of his loneliness despite his scholarship, his sense that modern life had lost something essential, some connection to mystery and meaning that earlier ages had possessed. "I think," Eleanor said, her words coming slowly, as though she were discovering them as she spoke. I think Thomas found what he was always seeking, there on that headland. Not consciously, perhaps, not deliberately, but nonetheless truly. He wanted to be part of something larger than himself, wanted his work to matter in ways that went beyond academic publications and museum displays. And now he has that. He maintains boundaries between worlds, speaks for the dead, performs rituals that have meaning and consequence. How can I begrudge him that, even though it means losing him from my own life? You cannot, Holmes said gently, and you should not try. Some losses are also gains. Some endings are also beginnings. Your brother has not died, Eleanor. He has transformed. And transformation, while painful for those who loved the previous form, is nevertheless a natural and necessary part of existence. Everything changes. Everything evolves or devolves. Everything moves from one state to another. Very little remains static. The train passed through small villages and market towns, through stations where people waited on platforms, with luggage and hopes and destinations known only to themselves. The light continued to fade, the landscape outside becoming increasingly abstract, shapes and shadows rather than distinct forms, and Watson found himself drifting in that peculiar state, between waking and sleeping, where thoughts became dreamlike, and time lost its usual linear progression. He thought of the chamber beneath the standing stones, of candles burning in niches carved by hands, long turned to dust, of bones arranged in patterns that spoke languages he could never fully learn. He thought of Thomas Ashford, kneeling before his altar of remembrance, speaking names into darkness, maintaining vigilance over boundaries most people never knew existed. He thought of Morwenna with her staff crowned with bone, leading her silent companions in their grey robes, guardians of mysteries preserved across millennia through dedication and sacrifice. The world, Watson reflected, was so much stranger than the civilized surfaces suggested, so much deeper than the gaslights and telegraph wires and rational discourse of modern life acknowledged. Beneath the veneer of progress and enlightenment, ancient currents still flowed, old knowledge still persisted, practices and beliefs that had sustained humanity through ages of darkness and uncertainty continued their work in hidden places, tended by those who understood their necessity, even if they could not fully explain their mechanisms. London welcomed them back with its familiar noise and chaos, the great city indifferent to their absence, unchanged by what they had witnessed and learned. Baker Street was as they had left it, 221B standing solid and ordinary among its neighbours, offering shelter and routine, and the comfort of known spaces, where one could sit by the fire and drink tea, and pretend the world made sense in ways that could be catalogued and understood. Mrs. Hudson fussed over them, bringing tea and biscuits without being asked, sensing somehow that they had encountered something taxing, something that required the small comforts of domesticity to restore equilibrium. Watson sank into his familiar chair with profound relief, feeling the tension of the past days beginning to drain away, replaced by bone-deep weariness that was not entirely unpleasant, the fatigue that comes from completing a difficult task and earning rest through honest effort. Holmes stood at the window, looking out at Baker Street, where evening was settling and gaslights were being lit one by one, creating islands of yellow warmth in the gathering darkness. Eleanor sat near the fire, her hands wrapped around a teacup, her expression peaceful in ways Watson had not seen since they first met. as though some essential question had been answered, some fundamental uncertainty resolved, even if the resolution was not what she had originally hoped for. "I shall return to Pendar in the spring," Eleanor said suddenly, her voice clear and decided, "when the weather is fair and the days are long. I shall visit Thomas and see how he fares, bring him news of London and assure him he is not forgotten by the world he left behind. And perhaps, over time, we shall forge a new relationship, different from what we had before, but no less real, no less valuable." "That seems wise," Holmes replied, without turning from the window. "Connections maintained across distance and difference are often stronger than those that exist only in proximity and similarity. You will be a link between worlds for him, Eleanor, a reminder that he made his choice not in isolation, but in context, that the work he does has meaning precisely because there are those like you who continue to live and love and struggle in the world he protects." Watson found his eyes growing heavy, the warmth of the fire and the comfort of his chair combining with accumulated fatigue to pull him towards sleep. He let himself drift, secure in the knowledge that he was home, that mysteries had been confronted, and understanding achieved, that his friends were safe, and the world, despite its strangeness, continued its turning with reassuring predictability. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across familiar walls where pictures hung, and bookshelves stood loaded with volumes containing knowledge both practical and esoteric. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with steady rhythm, marking seconds and minutes and hours with mechanical indifference. Time passing as it always passed, implacable and patient, carrying all things forward toward whatever futures waited in the unknown territory beyond the present moment. Holmes moved from the window to his chemistry table, where he began preparing some experiment that would occupy his restless mind through the evening hours. Eleanor sat in contemplative silence, her gaze fixed upon the flames, perhaps seeing in their shifting patterns some echo of mysteries witnessed, some reminder of brothers transformed and covenants maintained. And Watson, comfortable and warm and safe, allowed himself to sink deeper into that pleasant drowsiness that precedes true sleep, that gentle borderland where consciousness begins its nightly dissolution. The world was full of wonders, he thought, full of strangeness and beauty and a terror in equal measure. But it was also full of warmth and companionship and small comforts that made the strangeness bearable, that allowed one to confront mysteries and then return to familiar spaces where tea waited and fires burned and friends offered silent understanding that required no words. And so our tale concludes, dear listener, as all tales must, with questions answered and mysteries explained, to the degree that mysteries ever can be explained. Thomas Ashford keeps his vigil still, speaking names into darkness, maintaining boundaries between worlds, serving purposes older than any living memory. Eleanor returns to her life in London, carrying knowledge she cannot share, but which has nonetheless changed her, shaped her understanding of what is possible, what is real, what sacrifice's meaning sometimes demands. And Holmes and Watson, they continue their work as always, solving puzzles, unraveling mysteries, bringing light to dark corners while knowing that some darkness is necessary, that some mysteries serve better purposes remaining partially veiled, that truth comes in many forms, and not all truths need public revelation to have value and validity. If you have found comfort in this story, if it has accompanied you gently toward the realm of dreams, then I would be grateful if you would like this video Subscribe to see more stories woven from shadow and mystery, and the strange territories where reason meets wonder. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me what resonated, what questions linger, what other mysteries you would like to explore together in future tales. And now, as the fire burns low and the candles gutter in their holders, as the night deepens and the city quiets and sleep reaches out its soft hands to draw you into its embrace, I bid you good night. May your dreams be peaceful, may your rest be deep, may you wake refreshed and ready to face whatever mysteries tomorrow brings. Sleep well, dear listener, sleep well, and know that somewhere, in all the hidden corners of the world, watchers keep their vigil, guardians maintain their posts, and the boundaries that protect us hold firm through dedication and sacrifice. We may never fully comprehend, but can nonetheless honor with our respect and gratitude. Good night.